Welcome to the Vincast, Australia's premier wine podcast. Before this week's episode starts, I just want to shout out the guys from The Mitchin, Australia's most anarchically hilarious food podcast based out of Sydney. Recently, Andrew Levins, the host, sat down with Sue Dyson and Roger McShane from Living Wines and Food Tourist, who both were on an episode of the podcast earlier this year. And in that chat, they mentioned my recording with Sue and Roger on the Vincast, and that it was good research for that episode. So I really hope, Andrew, you enjoyed the podcast, and I would like to thank you for shouting it out on the show. And if you're a listener of the Vincast, I really recommend checking out The Mitchin. It isn't for the faint of heart. Things do get pretty rowdy, and particularly recent episodes where they were out on the town with a few beverages under their belts. But do check it out. It's very funny. It's a great look at the restaurant and dining scene in Sydney. And if you do listen to it, please leave them a rating and review on iTunes, and make sure to let them know that you heard about it on this podcast. On episode 108 of the Vincast, I chat with Ned Goodwin, Master of Wine, importer of Australian wines into Japan, and also the ambassador for Charles Heidsieck Champagne. Hello there, Vincasters! Welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and what an incredible week I had in Mildura this past week for the Australian Alternative Varieties Wine Show, which was a pretty grueling schedule, probably more so for the judges, I would think. They tasted a lot of wine in a couple of days, but it was really amazing to check out Mildura, see some of the vineyards and producers, meet lots of people involved in the wine industry, particularly those focused on alternative varieties, and also to sit down with a number of people. Now, if you didn't already listen to last week's episode, I sat down with Sarah Ahmed, the wine detective, who was the international guest judge. And for this week's episode, I actually had a really amazing conversation with Ned Goodwin Mw, who was up in Mildura for the show. Particularly, there was a seminar about alternative variety wines from Australia in export markets. So Ned, who worked for many years in Japan, became the first Japan-based master of wine, has some experience in the Asian market. So I led a really interesting conversation about how to break into those markets with these different wines. So I thought it would be fantastic while we had the opportunity to sit down, talk a bit about his background, his journey to becoming an MW, and it was really interesting. So I hope you enjoy the chat. Please do stick around until the end of the episode to find out how you can get in contact with both of us. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Ned, thank you for making some time in your extremely busy schedule. I'm glad to be able to finally sit down with you whilst we're both here in beautiful, sunny, warm Mildura.
Not at all, James. A pleasure.
And
good to be here.
It was really lovely. Listen to you speak about the Asian market, particularly in the context of alternative variety wines from Australia. And obviously Asia, particularly Japan, is very important to you. But
Yep.
I'm interested to know, because I usually ask at the start of every episode my guest if they can remember if there was a particular incident with wine that actually made them think about wine in a different way. What was just sort of the first important interaction with wine that set you on the path?
Well, I was a student in Paris for a number of years, and I was going out with a French girl at the time. I must have been about 19, maybe between 19 and 21. And I went into a store on a Sunday, and of course, being fairly naive at the time, I didn't realise that the only stores open of a Sunday are fairly sort of, egregious Algerian, Moroccan deli-type stores. And the French, of course, having a holiday right across retail on that day, or at least small store retail. Anyway, I went into this store and I bought a bottle of wine from the Loire Valley, not really knowing where that was or what that stood for. And I remember sitting there and thinking, this wine absolutely lacks generosity, friendliness. It was astringent, thoroughly green and unpleasant. And of course, I labelled not only all Loire Valley wines as such thereafter, at least for a time. I also labelled French wine like that for a considerable time, complaining to my girlfriend ever afterwards, where's the sun?
Yeah.
Where's the sun in the wine?
They were a bit mean.
Yeah, they were a bit mean.
Like Parisians can be.
Exactly. Of course, I learnt after that, particularly upon visiting Provence, that not everything's that way. And I think very differently now, of course. But that was a very early, naive impression of French wine, and it wasn't positive. And conversely, things are largely positive for me now, given what I know.
It's nice that things have improved since that first inauspicious experience with wine.
I suppose in the context of speaking here in sunny Mildura, as you put it, at the alternative varieties show, I certainly see far more generosity in the wines here, as you would expect. And
sure.
In context of that very early experience, I rather appreciate it. Although I've sort of gone into the world of savoury and textural a lot of the time, in contrast to those mean, stingy wines that you find so frequently at the lower price tier, of course, especially among the naive or the students as I was. There's a lot to be said about the generosity of Australian wine.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think even a struggling artiste in Australia can find generosity in the Australian wines.
Yeah.
Where were you from originally?
Well, look, I was born in London,
Okay.
and when the Japanese ask me where I'm from, they usually ask it in the context of blood, which is not particularly politically correct these days, but I'll say I was born in London, but I was raised in Sydney.
Right.
And in fact, I was only 5 months old when I was brought out to Sydney. And my mother is from Balmain, my dad's from Cessnock. He moved to Sydney when he was 17, 18 to work. So I'm quintessentially pretty Sydney,
Yeah.
But it's amazing, despite having two passports and despite, sort of proudly proclaiming my Sydney-sidedness, if there's such a word, the Japanese will still ask me this. And then when I tell them that I was born in London, I'm British. It doesn't matter, but I see myself as very Australian and very much from Sydney.
If you feel that you yourself are a product of sunshine?
Oh, absolutely. Surfing all my life and whatnot.
And were your parents interested in wine at all growing up? Or
I wouldn't say they were necessarily interested, but wine was always around. My father was an industrial designer.
Okay.
Or he still is. I mean, he teaches now sort of into semi-retirement. But my point being is there was always quite an appreciation of aesthetics. They're both still good cooks.
Yep.
And so there was wine about. I don't remember a meal passing without a bottle of wine on the table. So
Great.
There was always wine. I don't remember I do have vague memories of, Mick Williams claret or something back in the 70s, if they made a claret, but something along those lines, a very fusty old Mick Williams label. I know it was Hunter, and I remember what I can recall now, knowing a bit about European wine, it was labelled as some sort of quasi English branding of European classics. So I think it was a claret or something along
some
those
sort
lines.
of wine
In any
version.
case, yeah, there was wine about.
Okay. And were your parents sort of well travelled? Were they
Yeah,
influenced
they
by
were.
a lot of different cuisines, that kind of thing?
Look, they're well travelled. I mean, they told me all the places I'd been to. When I was old enough to appreciate it, simply on the way back to Australia from the UK, because they brought me back on the Canberra, which was a cruise liner until it was used during the Falklands War as an aircraft carrier. So it was sort of recreated for the purpose of the war, and after that sort of utilitarian moment of glory, it was then, I think, sunk, or put somewhere as a museum. But in any case, on the way back, we passed through all sorts of lands and cultures, and they'd lived in, I think, the UK for the best of 15 years. So through that experience, they'd been to the continent on numerous occasions. So yes, but this was the 70s. I mean, I see myself, in terms of the sort of seminal moments that shaped my life, aside from music.
Yeah.
Actually, no, and inclusive of music, largely 70s. Although being 47, obviously my high school was mostly through, actually all through the 80s.
Yeah.
But I suppose the point being there were still those staples of the 70s, like Steak Diane, which I remember very clearly, and still like today, that my mother cooked, and beef stroganoff and goulash.
Yep.
And I suppose you could
meals.
claim that these things were exotic, but whether they came out of the Woman's Weekly cookbook or they came from my parents' experience in Europe, I'm not quite sure which. Probably a bit of both.
I think of the Women's Weekly kind of cookbook, and you think of these pictures with these really glazed sort of dishes and like this combination of savoury and sweet pineapple and all this stuff.
Exactly.
It's a bit scary when you think about it. But do you think you had a reasonably typical upbringing in Sydney?
No, not really, because we moved from... I suppose so to some extent, but we moved into a place in Piermont, which nowadays is a very affluent inner city suburb, but back then it was a really rough place.
Right.
And my father bought a National Trust building. It was narrow, but it was tall. It was about 5 stories, big rooms, high ceilings, and obviously endless staircases being so narrow. And we lived in that, and he utilised that as his office at the same time. So that was a rather unusual place to be brought up, given that I wasn't living in a housing commission place, and I wasn't a petty criminal. That said, and I kid you not, I'm not exaggerating for the sake of the story, it was the type of place when you walked out of your front door, and especially in a private school uniform as I had on, you would either hit someone first or they would hit you. And so I learned to fight pretty well, and it was a bit rough and tumble, but I always just pined to get the hell out of there.
Sounds a bit like prison.
It was horrible. But now, I mean, the greatest irony, I mean, like so many inner city neighbourhoods, I'm sure in Melbourne as well.
Yeah, Fitzroy.
I mean, it's affluent now, and a lot of those housing commission places on Sydney Harbour have been turned into huge, sort of penthouse apartments. In any case, they moved, and therefore I moved, to Bondi when I was, I don't know how old I was. I would have been maybe 13 to 15, somewhere in there. And even prior to that, I'd spent a lot of time in Bondi. I used to get the 4:30 a.m. bus from Elizabeth Street opposite David Jones to Bondi every morning, waking up in Piermont, skateboarding across the overpass, and then surfing, leaving my board at a mate's house, and then doing the same thing after school. So inevitably, I think my parents just felt that they had to move there. So my brother and I moved there, and Bondi was a different story. These were the days before these were the days before the sort of the hipster culture. Bondi was very much full of Maoris and heroin. And when we first moved there, we didn't have a stove, and so we finally got one. But my parents took my brother and I pretty much out, I would say 3 to 4 times a week to eat.
Wow.
And most of the times we were going to places in and around East Sydney, Stanley Street, which is still, I mean, it's lost its allure today, but it was sort of a little pocket of former Italian soup kitchens to cater for the waves of Italian emigres back in the 50s, 60s, so forth. And so we're going to places there a lot. And some of those are still somewhat legendary, like Bar Reggio. And we were going to, my mother's obsessed with Sri Lankan, Indian, Pakistani food. And as a young kid, of course, that was torture. But it was a matter of stuffing as much down your throat as you could before the chili kicked in.
The heat got you.
Yeah, but now I'm sort of appreciative in a morbid way now. Yeah.
So you were very much interested in music and in surfing. Did you have an idea, sort of late teens and into adulthood, what you might want to do, or did you sort of think about travelling?
No, not really. I was an exchange student to Japan when I was 15, 16.
Okay.
So I lived in rural Japan for 1 year. So that really set the tone for so much of what I do today, even though I never set out to be so closely connected to Japan after that time for a good 15 years.
Far out.
But that I learnt pretty solid Japanese. I mean, when I say solid, I first of all, I learnt self-discipline because I was in an area where virtually no one spoke English. And this was 85, 86. So Japan is still relatively uninternational today. Back then it was just, sheerly insular. And I was sandwiched between the foothills of the Japanese Alps and the Japanese Sea in a prefecture, a county, if you will, with the smallest population of any of the 43 prefectures in Japan.
Right.
So that was 1 year going to school like a normal Japanese student with a wonderful host family, albeit no one speaking English. So I decided that the book that was thrust into my hands when we first arrived, sort of, We Are the World, the children, the United Nations gathering of exchange students, I decided that we had this textbook thrust upon us, and I just started going through 2 chapters a night for a year. And I suddenly realized that, with a bit of discipline and a sense of purpose, all sorts of things can be achieved. Point being is, going back to Australia after that was a bit of a readjustment process, far harder actually than going to Japan. And I then ended up just wanting to travel. So I went back to Japan in 1989 for the second time.
Okay.
That was a bit of a sordid experience because I made the mistake, like I suppose many human beings do, of trying to recreate the same experience again and, falling on my face and having a, utterly miserable time. But then I went on to Switzerland and Paris and New York, and I don't, even though this all sounds like I'm being fueled by my parents, I haven't taken any money from my father since I was 18, so most of it was in fact just fueled from free food and drink at bars that my mates worked at, and in turn me working for free food and drinks at bars, and also manning telephones and working in the tuck shop or the canteen or whatever it may be. But then, after moving my way through all of that, I arrived in New York, worked my way up through the sommelier culture, and ended up working in probably at the time the finest wine listed restaurant in the world. And that was during the Clinton.com era. Drank salubrious wines that I'll never drink again, and most of us won't, simply because those wines are now I suppose the sole bastion of wealthy Chinese. And from there, I broke up with a girl. More honestly, she left me, and I was offered a role in Japan. So suddenly, I was taken back to Japan, and I said yes. I just needed to get out of New York, and so there I was. All of that sort of that circle or the semicircle suddenly became a full circle, and I was back.
Yeah. So whilst you were traveling, do you think that that discipline you talked about, having to teach yourself when you were in Japan, and no doubt, a real sense of independence, do you think that really helped you as you're traveling and having to think about who do I know in this place and how can I get the most out of the experience?
That's a really good question, and I like to think yes. It certainly helped me later with Master of Wine Studies and whatnot, but I think so. I mean, while I would still say, and it sounds a little bit pessimistic, but I still don't imagine, no matter how long I live, that exchange student experience will ever be surpassed in terms of the stamp it's had on me. I still think it's the greatest experience of my life to date, and again, I don't think there will be a better one, sadly. No, not necessarily sadly, just acceptingly. During my sort of dilettante years throughout Europe and early New York anyway, before working as a sommelier became increasingly serious, I was never cognizant of any, relationship between that self-discipline and anything else. But I would imagine that, yes, thinking back, I mean, I knew how to, I'd been teased, humiliated by, Japanese racist students. I didn't speak a lick of a language. I managed to live in, absolutely the middle of nowhere by Japanese standards for a year, but at the same time nurture great friends and a loving relationship with a host family that took me in. And I still try to go back when I can there, even though most of my time in Japan is spent in Tokyo. So with all of that under my belt, I suppose nothing could really, slay me. Yeah.
As far as your travels, did you have any ideas about what kind of experience you might have wanted to have, or you just sort of needed to go and see stuff? Did you want
I
to
think
do
at the beginning
stuff,
it was sort
eating,
of
drinking, all
it was
that
not
sort of stuff?
no it was at the beginning it was just notching up notches on the totem pole.
Sure.
But I suppose that's the mindset of a younger person.
Yeah.
And then by the time I'd had a great deal of fulfillment at the higher end of the wine world through being a sommelier in New York, then my focus was much more succinct, honed. It was far more food and wine centric.
Sure.
So from thereafter, my mid to late 20s to early 30s, I think I was 31 or so by the time I left New York, then yes, it was more of the ilk of what we're doing now. Yeah.
So I'm starting to work in hospitality. This was possibly, just a way to support yourself. At what point did you kind of think, oh, there's something more to this? And how did you kind of build your connection with wine towards the path that led you on to wanting to become an NW?
Okay. So there was a seminal moment. I mentioned the one with the Algerian wine, but there was another one which is more related to this question, in that it was perhaps the catalyst for thinking about wine and working with wine and its relationship with food and so forth as a serious career option. And I travelled across country from New York to Los Angeles 1 year, and I was a model when I was younger. And so the relationship between that and wine is absolutely non-existent, except I was told that I should go to Los Angeles because maybe I could carve out some sort of career, in acting or so forth. And so in preparation for this, during my early period in New York, I was going to a theatre school called the Atlantic Theatre Company. So Heath Ledger went there, and a bunch of Skeet Ulrich went there and so forth. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to go over to LA. So off I went. And I met this bloke, David Rosoff, who ended up being one of my great mentors. He was the wine director at a restaurant called Michael's in Santa Monica. Right. And I told him, look, I don't want any responsibilities, David. I'm going to be this actor. I've got it all mapped out. I'm going to surf during the day. And
I'm sure he said to you, yeah, I've heard that before.
Yeah, he did. And he showed me the wine list, and he was surprised how much I knew about the wines on the list. And so after I said, no responsibility, I only want so many shifts. And then after a certain period of time, a couple of months or something, he came up to me and he said, look, would you like to be my associate wine director? And I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? All I really do is read wine books on the toilet anyway. I said, why not? And so I did. And that was when I started really thriving in hospitality and seeing it as a conduit to something a bit more serious. I didn't know quite what or when, and the MW wasn't in my mind at that point. But I certainly saw a career in wine through hospitality.
Right.
And then I returned to New York, and things sort of blazed on from there.
So even up to that point, you found yourself to be fairly studious as far as just wanting to learn more.
Yes.
Reading whatever you could. Presumably, going to tastings. Did you visit wineries?
I used to at that point. I'd visited wineries in France, mostly in the southwest, only because the girl I mentioned earlier was actually from the Aveyron, which is a fairly poor wine region, if any. I mean, sure. But it wasn't too far from things like, the Basque. It wasn't too far from Cahors, from Bergerac, etc., poor man's Bordeaux type areas. And so I went down to places like this, and she also studied, or her brother studied, at the University of Montpellier. So I spent quite a bit of time in the Languedoc, and then skipping to a number of years later, when I left New York, I ended up renting a house for almost 6 months in the Languedoc. But anyway, at that point, I'd been to these areas, not necessarily major wine regions, but by the time I was in California, we used to go, I've been to Napa so many times I can't remember, and even more attractive to me were places like Santa Barbara, Santa Ynez, which are an easy drive up the coast, hour and a half or so, and I'd always want to escape LA on a weekend, whenever I could, and then places like Paso Robles, which is very beautiful, and it's become much more interesting with Rhone varieties since the time I lived there. But in any case,
and certainly fitting in with your love of surfing.
Exactly.
Between Santa Barbara and
Santa Barbara
Cruz,
is great.
Just fantastic.
So and I've surfed Rincon when it's been really, really good.
Yeah.
That area there. Once you go past that, it all gets a bit cold and sharky. But LA to Santa Barbara is inclusive of Santa Barbara is pretty nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did you kind of, get enough of a you were known enough as a sommelier when you were back in New York for you to be approached by someone to come work in Japan? And how did they know that you spoke Japanese?
Well, they did, because I just met this guy who happened to be the CEO of this very large publicly held restaurant company called Global Dining, with about 65 restaurants throughout Japan, Tokyo-centric, and a couple in LA. So I met this guy.
Okay. Japanese restaurants?
Well, a bit of everything. Japanese restaurants, Italian sort of trattoria type restaurants, the typically sort of Japanese high-end French dining, and then, off the cuff, casual Southeast Asian inspired noodle joints.
Right.
Bit of everything, really. But
Sure.
it was interesting because I'd come from this place called Veritas where, the average spend on a bottle of wine was around $580 a night. And I'm not kidding you. I mean, people would come in and I used to know Tony Bourdain because he worked across the road at Leal. Les Al, as New Yorkers call it. And he used to come into Veritas a lot because the chef there was a guy called Scott Bryant. And if you ever read the first book he wrote, Kitchen Confidential, there's a chapter dedicated to Scott Bryant called The Life of Bryant. And he talks about Veritas and the three sommeliers in a restaurant with a tome of a wine list and only sort of circa 48 seats. And I was one of the three, you see.
Yeah.
So at that point, the wines we were privy to, because we would vet all of the wines before serving, and not to mention that the customer type, while they were very wealthy, they weren't largely braggarts. They were people with so much money that they had a great pleasure in drinking the finest wine known to man, and they also had a great pleasure in sharing it around the restaurant.
Okay.
And so, I mean, we were pouring back then. We were pouring I remember this because it's so scarce, this wine. But we were pouring Raveneau Premier Cru Buteau by the glass, and this was.
How did you get that big an allocation?
Well, back then it wasn't an issue because
Right.
China hadn't become involved. Japan wasn't as perhaps involved as it is, or
Yeah.
it has been for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And we were serving it for 25 a glass. And at that point, 25 a glass, in Sydney, Melbourne, that's a glass of champagne.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
a fairly mundane type of champagne
Yeah.
at that. Back then, it seemed very expensive. In any case, it was a great place to learn. It was sort of the Encyclopedia Britannica. So I had a lot of great wine experience up my sleeve. I mean, sorry to keep harping on about this, but I just discovered all of these old menus from this restaurant that
Wow.
I'd kept. And, I mean, we did an Henri Jayer vertical from the first vintage to the last of Echezeaux, of Croix Parenteau. I remember we did a 61 left bank versus right bank tasting with, a slew of Petrus, Cheval Blanc. And this was the sort of place...
From great vintages.
From
no
great
doubt, yeah.
vintages. And back then, I mean, people were coming in and paying $2-3 grand for a dinner like that. And, of course, a dinner like that now, you or I would not be the participants necessarily, but the people who would be paying, they'd be paying tens, 20,000s for a dinner like that.
Yeah.
Mostly probably in the likes of Hong Kong, maybe
Sure.
a little bit in New York, but not so much anymore even.
Yeah, fair
In
enough.
any case, things have changed. The paradigm has shifted, the dynamic has changed. I had experience by the time I met this Japanese guy at a tasting, completely impromptu. We started speaking Japanese and he knew the restaurant Veritas. So it was just a click.
Right. So it must have been, a big decision.
It was, but I was walking through the streets of New York with my tail between my legs. This girl at the time had left me, and I just needed to get out. Really,
Sure.
I'd had my fill.
Yep.
And it's funny, my wife. At the moment, and who knows how that long will last. Anyway.
Do you want me to edit that part out,
No,
man?
it's fine. You can keep it on. I'll play it to her. Where were we with that? Yeah. She misses New York because that's where we met. But I don't miss it
really?
at all. I
Okay.
had such my fill of late nights, and you can imagine the sort of debauchery that goes on among the hospitality world in a city like that when you finish at 2 a.m. and you
Sure.
want to go out and vindicate your existence by having quote unquote, a civilized drink with your friends, which turns into, sort of barbecued duck until 4 a.m. and then so forth and so forth. And
I
the
think
next
that's
thing you know,
that's an
you're back on
ironic
the floor.
concept, isn't it?
Yeah.
In the hospitality, it's an ironic concept.
Yeah.
Civilized.
Yeah. So Japan seemed a good route to self-reparation, to rediscovery, so forth and so forth. So I just took the plunge.
So were you working as a wine director for a number of different venues?
Well, I was working as the wine director for the
wine
entire
director.
company,
Yeah,
and of course
okay.
the Japanese being, this guy being this guy, and liking the whole sort of corporate swagger, my official title initially was corporate sommelier. And I said to him, this sounds sort of a bit dichotomous. I said,
Exactly.
you might want to tweak that. And actually, in the end, I just took matters into my own hands and tweaked it and just called myself the wine director.
So
Yeah.
how did you find it, heading back to Japan and with a really, very serious job?
Initially challenging because the level of appreciation and wines that I'd come from at Veritas, which, I was still in my early 30s, and it's amazing as a 47-year-old you think back to those times, and at that you think you're pretty old and learned then, but you realize that you're not, and wisdom and humility I suppose just keeps getting larger. You're filled with it more and more as you realize your fallibilities and age and weaknesses. In any case, then I was a bit upset by it all, because I arrived and I thought, Jesus, a lot of these younger people, especially in the lower end restaurants, they don't know the difference between white or red. Right. So but then I realized the virtues and the rewards of being able to communicate, differentiate these, what appeared coming from Veritas as this elite sommelier, as being bleeding obvious. Albeit I realized that suddenly I was bringing wine to a whole new populace.
Sure.
And I was inspiring all of these younger people, many of whom, and I'm proud to say, have gone on to become some of the more influential sommeliers in the world. The sommelier, or the sub-sommelier at Noma, for example, was one of the young guys I worked with for 10 years. And Japan's ambassador for Dom Perignon. He now works for my company, the little company that I co-own there called Wine Diamonds.
Yes.
He's now a chief salesperson, but he was their ambassador throughout Japan for a number of years. And we had a couple of guys in Melbourne who worked at Izake Arden and City Wine Shop and so forth, who also work with me. So, I said to my dad, who was a teacher, I said, God, after all those years, there are just 3 to 5 guys who really made it. He said, look, it doesn't matter. It's never about the number. It's about the quality.
Sure.
And I thought, okay, well, that's nice to think that there was some sort of legacy, because at the beginning it was frustrating.
Absolutely. When you started to work in Japan again, how did you find the wine market as far as accessibility to the sort of wines that you had grown accustomed to at Veritas, and how did you find it, particularly in terms of training, and then the actual end consumers? Was there a lot of interest in those kinds of wines? A
lot of interest among consumers, just given that there's what the Japanese called akogare, which means a nostalgic pining for. I mean, it's a pretentious way to put it, but I know it no other way. It's the notion that Paris is still this place of Renoir, and the wine reflects that, and so there is an obsession with things French in Japan. They just love it.
I have heard that the rates of Japanese tourists arriving in Paris and being so offended by it being dirty, too busy, and Parisians being so in your face.
They actually have a term for it.
Yeah, and they get sent to hospital?
They do. They get sent to hospital. Well, you're one of the few people. When I say this to people think I'm just exaggerating for the sake of story.
I've heard of it.
It's actually a real phenomenon. They get sent to hospital because they just can't accept that things don't look like a Toulouse-Lautrec cafe.
Yeah.
And in any case, though, this has very positive repercussions, not necessarily for those people who end up in hospital with some sort of psychic disorder based on the reality versus their, perceived reality.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But it has positive repercussions for, brand France in Japan.
Sure.
And I've got a good French mate, and he often says, if I shit in a bottle, they'll drink it. And and he's not off the mark. That said, and so as a result, I should say, there was plenty of interest in great French wine. But what I was stunned by was the lack of interest. When I was at Veritas, Australian, or at least heavily Parkerized expensive Australian, it was really its halcyon era. So we were seeing Australian wine, Rick Burgess wines out of the Barossa, Wild Duck Creek. Some of these wines were over $1,000 on a wine list in the United States.
Yeah.
And now we're struggling to sell Australian wine, of course, outside of the cheap and cheerful category. And so it was a really interesting time for Australian wine, or at least it seemed that way. I mean, I was so proud to suddenly see all these Australian wines on a wine list in one of the best wine lists in New York or in the world. And by the time I got to Japan, of course, not realizing that the whole Parkerized thing was on its descendancy anyway in the West.
It's become a bit on the nose.
It had indeed, but I suddenly saw absolutely no interest in Australian wine, and it wasn't because of Parker. It was just because the Japanese never had any interest anyway, and they had no interest in virtually any wine outside of France, Italy, which was rewarding because I love Italian wine and I love everything that Italy stands for, well, at least culinarily. Huge, and I thought that was pretty sophisticated. At that point, though, I didn't realise other Asian markets had no idea about Italy, but lots of Italian wine. And then I also saw the ascendancy, or already the boom of natural wine, and this was 15 years ago.
Wow.
It was already huge. And became huger.
I've always been interested to find out, how natural wine got into Japan and where that interest.
There were a couple of
traveling and
a couple of key tastemakers there.
Right.
One was a guy called François Dumas, who used to be the manager for Serge Gainsbourg and the singer. And he leveraged that, I suppose, and became a sort of cool hipster natural wine importer.
Oh, wow.
And then there's another one, a woman called Goda, as in her surname. I can't remember her first name. And she still runs a company that's very powerful in that world called Racine. And those two really, R-A-C-I-N-E-S, as in roots.
Yep.
And those two really brought natural wine to the table. I also think, a number of things we could all talk about minimal intervention, biodynamics, organics, be it food, wine, or otherwise, as being a sort of a retort to growing industrialized world, and with that use of chemicals. But in Japan, I think it goes another step. I think the proximity to China, the decline of the economy, the increasing sense of being feeble in the face of all of this, not to mention, which really sort of, it put an exclamation mark on this movement, the 2011 earthquake. It suddenly made Japanese feel very comfortable with things that they believed, whether real or not, were less messed with, manipulated, were of the earth, natural, so forth, mellifluous.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, at what point did you start? Were you living in Japan when you started to think about, furthering your...
I was, because I just thought to myself, okay, I arrived in Japan in, I think it was end of 2002. Then it came back here came back to Australia for the first time in 11 years. After securing the job, going to check the operation out, came back here for Christmas and a good 3 weeks of holiday, and then went back and started work seriously. And then the following, whatever it was, holiday, I remember it was 2003, and I went to India for the first time. And I was in Goa. It was the off-season. There was nothing particularly, debauched going on. But I was with my former roommate in Paris, who'd married an Indian woman, a Tamil.
Oh, wow.
And he's now an academic. He's a professor at Columbia, and he was down there studying anthropology and the Tamil language. Went down, short and sweet, 2-week running around with him, focused on the south. But he said to me, Ned, after all, knowing you in Paris and so forth, and you're this sommelier, now you're in Japan doing this wine directorship. He said, what are you going to do next? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, you've always liked reading and studying. Why don't you do the MW? And so he's not a wine guy, but he's an ambitious, studious character. And I thought, okay, that sounds rather good. And so I went back and I researched it, and then I sort of got stuck into it.
Yeah. And as far as the preparations for the MW, did you find it challenging doing it in Japan? Because up until that point, there were no Japanese MWs, and
no.
And how did you kind of develop a network of support as far as tasting wines?
That's a really good
question.
And I think the answer is going to be interesting for your listeners, because I actually found it far less of it. Well, look, I have no comparison, but I certainly came to Australia and Bordeaux and whatnot for the prerequisite seminars each year.
Sure.
And I found, in lieu of that, and in retrospect, Japan arguably far less challenging, because the availability of wine in Tokyo, which is where I was based, is pretty much on par with London and New York anyway.
Okay.
So there were no problems there. And I think the greatest virtue of having done it in Japan is that I probably didn't sound like a broken record.
Right.
And while I didn't really have the camaraderie and the fellow student support and the tasting groups, as you mentioned, that one would have in a Western market, what I did have, I had enough key tastemakers to hang around with and make sure that I could access good wine at an affordable price. But I also found that not being part of that whole sort of, mechanism in the UK and in Sydney, Melbourne, where gaggles of MW students gather together and read books and repeat the same thing. I only reflect, and I was told this, that what I was saying was actually came across as rather unique and rather different, and probably stood out as a result to the examiners.
Yeah.
And of course, there was no cognizant intent at all. I was just in Japan and I was getting on with what I needed to get on with.
Yeah.
But I read what I was required to. I went to the seminars, but perhaps I was thinking a little bit more out of the box.
Right. And I think that Japan is one of those unique places where there is utmost respect for someone who is, going away and really laboriously studying, the culture of Ronin, of course.
Yes, exactly.
Where you go away for a year just so you can re-sit exams to get into university. I think that, they would have had the utmost respect for you,
yes.
Really preparing quite thoroughly. How many years did it take you to prepare?
It took me, by the time I began, so 2003, I was pondering. I think I actually started in 2004 and passed in 2010.
Yeah.
So 6-ish years, give or take.
And that's reasonably good for
I think on average, for those who
7+.
pass,
Yeah.
and the pass rate, I don't know where it sits now, but I think it's sort of around 30%.
Yeah.
I think it's on average 8.5 years.
Yeah.
Something like so it's fairly swift.
And you passed first time?
I passed. No, my strategy was, well, of course, ideally I would have passed everything the first time. But no, my strategy was to pass the theory, which I saw as the more challenging, laborious, book-driven
rote learning
discipline.
Yeah.
A lot of essays involved and so forth, and one really has to write in a very Oxfordian fashion.
Mm-hmm.
Young children, I thought, okay, I'll get that out of the way. And so I passed that at the first attempt, and then I thought, with my sommelier background, as long as I learned the sort of systematic approach that they like to, they'd like to see someone writing tasting notes with, not to mention honing my time management skills, because you just got to bloody well finish the tasting.
Sure.
But that was a real sort of systematic. Go for the jugular approach. But I knew, based on the wines I'd experienced, and just having worked in these places throughout the world at that stage, I'd get through that with some disciplined approach, systematic approach to writing and identifying. And so I passed that the next year. And that was the strategy from the outset.
And what was your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on, I can't remember the exact title, it was rather wordy, I imagine, but my dissertation was on the physiological preferences for Japanese restaurant consumers within a very tightly defined sort of upper tier restaurant with an accredited sommelier on the floor for wines by the glass.
Right.
In fact, whether what they were getting is what they physiologically actually desired.
Sure.
And so I ran a bunch of surveys, interviews, and so forth to gather collate original concrete data. But of course, as I inferred during my opening intro today during the speech, in Japan, being a consensual society with a collective sort of groupthink, it's often hard to get people to speak out about what they really like and what they don't like.
Yeah.
And so I didn't really come up with yays or nays, but what I did come up with was that, which is interesting enough for a Western sort of observer. And I also came up with the fact that there was plenty of room to maneuver in Japan because, as you said earlier, they have such a respect for authority.
Sure.
And so Japan is, they've got these legions of sommeliers out there. I always think the Japanese consumer is the best in the world because they'll just defer to the authority figure, the sommelier, who's supposed to know.
Yep.
And so if the sales pitch, if the introduction is done with verve and personal anecdotes that are interesting, then the Japanese consumer is generally somebody who's going to believe and want to drink whatever that pitch is toward.
And as a sommelier, that must be incredibly,
empowering.
It
is, but the
also
Japanese don't latch onto it because of the culture. They find it very hard to be too direct.
Okay.
They will wait for the inevitable finger point to, of course, what is largely the familiar. And so a lot of those wines that are, without going to the extreme niche category of natural, a lot of the conventionally made wines from grape varieties that are lesser known, regions that are perhaps not on the mainstream map, they just get lost in the wash. And I always think, God, if this was a New Yorker with that sort of audience, that sort of customer type, everything goes, you know, and that's what I liked about New York. But there's something rather respectful and lovely, I suppose, about such dutiful attention to the customer experience that you have in Japan.
Sure. So becoming the first Japan-based MW, do you think that had a pretty big impact? And do you think it was aspirational for a lot of people, a lot of Japanese people?
I don't know if the MW became aspirational for a lot of people, but I think it had a great deal of impact in terms of the Japanese suddenly realizing that their wine culture was being observed by an influential outsider who happened to live there.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
And brought a little bit more international attention to Japan as a wine market.
It did, and I wrote a sort of piece for Jancis. Well, I didn't write it for Jancis Robinson, but I wrote a piece for actually a lifestyle magazine in Hong Kong called, of all things, Prestige. And somebody from Jancis...
very imaginative names.
I know, right? Somebody from Jancis read it. I think it may have been Neil Martin. Anyway, they recommend. I know Jancis reasonably well, and they recommended it to her, and she read it, and then she wanted to publish it. And she created the title, which became a bit contentious, Why Japan Lost Its MW. That was not my original title. But this piece was published or translated and then published in Japanese. And that actually kicked off a bunch of sleepless nights for me, because it was a bit of a furore, you know.
I can imagine, like, loss of face is such an important
thing. But in the end, well, you have to, don't you? I let it go. And the most rewarding aspect of that story is that, well, whether the translated version reflected the English version, which I thought was probably the strongest thing I've ever written, I'm not sure. However, I really believe I said a lot of truthful things that the Japanese, being such face savers, being so concerned about groupthink and so forth, could never have said. And what's wonderful about that in retrospect now, even though, as I said, it created a great deal of concern for me, is that when I go back to Japan, which I do 6 to 7 times a year for all sorts of things, there are so many young Japanese, aspirational Japanese, who will come to hear me speak, to conduct a tasting and so forth. And I truly believe, despite the MW, which was the platform, had I not written that as an MW living in Japan with Japanese experience across a decade plus, that level of influence probably would not have been the same.
Sure. So once you did become an MW, what were your plans? Did you think long term about staying in Japan, and what did you think about, coming back to Australia?
Yeah, I was always, even before that, I was always thinking about coming back to Australia. I just wasn't sure how it could be done.
Sure.
When I say how it could be done, of course, I could have just severed all my ties and just come back and started from ground zero.
Yeah.
But at this point, I didn't quite want to do that. 2 children, decent paying job, so forth. And a stimulating job, because one thing, be quiet, birds. One thing I haven't brought up is that during that wine directorship in Japan, I was given, carte blanche to the tune of a pretty solid expense account to go on 2 to 3 trips a year wherever I wanted.
Wow.
And often I would go for a month. And so I pretty much traveled all of the regions around the world that I desired to go to. So places like the Marche for Verdicchio and where else did I go that was rather obscure? Oh yeah, I went to Santorini for a Citigo, not to mention the fact that it's a beautiful place. But,
yeah, I know.
But I also covered the main bases to make sure that I'd been there for the MW preparation.
Sure.
And so I didn't really want to leave that sort of cushy nest. But then I began working for a champagne house, and I left that role as wine director, and I found myself coming back to Australia, a good number of times a year. And I realized, given Australia's buoyancy as a champagne market, whether I was based in Japan or here, meaning Australia, it wouldn't really be any skin off the champagne house's nose. And so that's when I realized I could move back here.
Right.
And so I did.
And is that when you say the champagne producer, are you referring to Charles Heidsieck?
I am. Yep.
Okay, and so did you have a particular love of champagne? I mean, obviously everyone does. If you're
Yes,
into
but
wine,
no, I was never a champagne geek.
Okay.
I always liked Charles. I always thought it was a brand, I mean, especially given its reserve wine culture, etc., that was always one of those geek brands that everyone in wine appreciated and respected, albeit a brand that was not marketed particularly well.
Okay.
Perhaps because it was owned, at least for the good 10 years or so before my involvement and before the new ownership in 2011 by Remy. And for them, I think owning a champagne house, they owned Krug for a while, but they offloaded that to the evil empire. But owning champagne houses was pretty much icing on the cake of the cognac, sort of focus.
Sure.
But in any case, Charles was an interesting proposition for me, and so I thought, okay, this sounds like fun, and it has been. And Japan is also a huge champagne market.
Yeah,
Thus
absolutely.
the reason for me being able to oscillate between Australia and Japan.
I mean, yeah, like Australia and Japan are easily both in the top 10.
Yeah, they are. They're
producers
sort of
of the world.
four. Japan and Australia 5 to 6. They're between there somewhere.
Sure.
Japan more sort of high-end stuff. Australia much more consumption overall. But obviously with Japan's greater population, that's mitigated by sheer
probably the
numbers.
The average price per dollar is probably a little bit higher in Japan as well.
Much higher. Price per unit they're the second biggest consumers of prestige cuvées in the world after the US.
Yeah,
whereas
absolutely.
I think we're the biggest consumers overall, albeit largely non-vintage,
Yeah.
per capita in the world. But
I always say thank goodness for Germany because at least they drink cheaper champagne than we do.
yeah.
And obviously the relationship with Japan and Australia continues with the business that you established as far as Wine Diamonds. So what was the particular idea behind that?
The idea behind that, going back to one of your earlier questions, was my frustration at the lack of visibility of Australian wine in Japan. And Australia is perceived, actually, it's perceived in a sort of anachronistic vein on many levels. And we don't promote this sort of irreverent sophistication that we do so well here vis-a-vis lifestyle, nor therefore with our wine. And so it was sort of, rugby players, surfers, blonde hair, and big, buxom sort of high volume wines. And so I thought, okay, given the sort of propensity of the Japanese tastemaker set toward the natural idiom, I thought, well, let's show them something different. And with that can be a platform for a whole lot of Australian producers to work through, their own promotions for premium or site-centric wines. And so there was a bit of an altruistic motive. I initially started as a hobby, and it's sort of now grown into a money-making enterprise. So that's nice.
And did you have a particular type of producer that you want to work with?
Yeah,
or did you kind of specifically target cooler climate regions?
Yeah, cooler climate definitely. Again, to juxtapose the styles we were going to introduce to the general perceptions, stereotypes among Japanese drinkers and more so sommeliers. And so definitely cooler climate regions, although we've tweaked that a bit. Definitely natural and definitely small independent winemakers.
Dynamic.
Yeah, dynamic,
okay.
Exactly.
And certainly some of the really lovely guys that you work with, some of whom have very, very kindly graced their presence on my podcast.
Yeah.
They are very involved with. I kind of, the way I look at it, what I compare to the 90s personality-based winemakers. They're going to Japan, they're going over to London, and they're really doing a great job of showing, look, there's still more to Australian wine. We're making different styles, we're working with different grape varieties, and I can imagine that the Japanese are sort of really just eating that stuff up.
Yeah, they love like any human being, but the Japanese more so. I mean, they're obsessed with provenance, and I think to communicate provenance, it would be the greatest travesty and indeed hypocrisy if one was not going to the market to as much as we talk about place, the person is such an integral, intrinsic part of that. So
Absolutely.
if the person is not going and meeting the consumer and really, communicating that place through that connection, then there's really no point. And the producers we work with are very good at that.
Yeah.
And look, nothing is going to be from the type of producers we work with, big volume. Nothing is going to really generate huge amounts of money, but it's definitely generated positive change and changed perceptions of Australian wine in Japan, and for that I'm very proud.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And no doubt you also do bits of consulting and as education masterclasses. If people were to, I'm sure whether you have time or not, if people were to wanting to engage you for something like that, whether it's to do with Charles Heidsieck, what's the best way for people to actually get in contact with you and follow you on social media and stuff like that?
I suppose so. They can just, without giving my email out over this interview,
interwebs,
they can certainly direct message me, or probably Facebook is the best way.
Sure.
Just find me on Facebook. I'm just Ned Goodwin. Nothing fancy.
Instagram, Twitter.
Yeah, both Instagram and Twitter. I had my Instagram account hacked.
Oh, goodness.
In China recently,
wow.
So I was brought down to an avatar of some police squadron motif, 0 followers, and then I contacted Instagram. And they sent out a security code. I had to handwrite it on a piece of paper, hold the piece of paper up to next to my face, and send them a selfie. And even with that, they couldn't reactivate or rectify the account. So I started off from scratch again with Instagram. So I was a bit pissed off with their reaction. In any case, maybe there was something political involved with it all. I was trying to operate on a VPN in a Chinese hotel because, of course, Instagram is illegal.
Yeah.
In any case, thus Instagram, yes, I'm on there, but back to ground zero. Twitter, been on there for a long time, seldom use it. Facebook, I was once not a believer, but it's a good way to keep track of everything that's going on and relatives and so forth. So I'm easily found.
Fantastic. And recently I happened to listen to a really lovely podcast hosted by another former guest of the podcast, Lee Tran Lam.
Yes.
With your younger brother, who is similarly in industry, similarly working in Sydney.
Yes.
And of course, he told everyone the revelation that you were both massive Kiss fans.
Yeah. It's funny. My mother still thinks I'm the Kiss fan. She doesn't understand, or she doesn't acknowledge that Glenn is probably not the bigger fan. I mean, Kiss were I'm more the generation, and Kiss
Sure.
were my childhood superheroes. And I saw them on Countdown with Molly Meldrum way before they became popular in 1979-80 with the album Dynasty, or Dynasty, I think as we say. But it was Rock and Roll All Night, which was on a 1975 album called Dress to Kill. And I remember seeing that, and it was after my 7th birthday, so that would have been 1976, on Countdown, a black and white clip. And it was really raw. They were still fairly, early in their careers. And I thought, oh my God, I've just seen God. And that was it. I wanted to breathe fire. And I was 7. And of course, a 7-year-old wouldn't listen to popular music like that now. They'd be, on games and so forth and so forth. But back then, there was no other distraction. And I looked so much forward to Molly Meldrum at 6 o'clock on Saturday nights. Or maybe it was a Sunday night, I can't remember. But anyway, that's when I saw it. And Glenn, of course, grew up in that sphere of influence, but he went on to become his own crazy Kiss fan and saw them probably more times than I did, having spent much longer in the US.
Yep.
But yeah, we're both pretty big Kiss fans.
No, I was really pleased to hear that. But look, I do recommend, of course, listening to that episode with Glenn. But I wanted to say thank you so much.
Oh, sheer pleasure, James. That was great. Thank you.
I really appreciated hearing a little bit more about your story. And, obviously, having, been an exchange student in Japan myself, it was really nice to actually hear, where you started from. And that's, even as a 15-year-old, that relationship to Japan started. So thank you very much. And I look forward to chatting with you further this evening and tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks, James. Really, really a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
And as always, my sincerest thanks for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. You can follow me on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, I'm at Intrepid Wino, and the podcast can be found on Twitter at the Vincast. head to my Facebook page, Intrepid Wino, hit that like button, check out some of the content I share there, and visit my YouTube channel, Intrepid Wino. I will be posting some videos of my recent experience in Mildura at the Alternative Varieties Wine Show. Make sure you subscribed and leave some likes and comments. Of course, I'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast on any number of different podcast hosting platforms like iTunes, Player FM, Stitcher, Podbean. Subscribing means you get the newest episode as soon as it becomes available, and it is also a really fantastic way to provide some feedback not only to myself but also to potential listeners and guests by leaving a rating and review. Let me know which might have been your favorite episodes. Would love for you to visit me at intrepidwino.com. You can get in contact with me at thevincast@gmail.com. Look, I've got plenty of upcoming episodes I'm very excited about. Thanks for being on board, but until next time, bye.